Richard McPherson, we're back for yet another one, baby. How are you?
I am great, and I'm really looking forward to talking about this one because this one I know a lot.
Okay, so I didn't know anything about Chernobyl, like my entire life till I met you, but it has become the buzzword. Like it is in the lexicon. It is it is in the ether. It's like, oh, Chernobyl. It's going to go Chernobyl, right? And it has always been what I envisioned as like the classic example of a nuclear reactor just exploding, right? It's the anxiety that I think.
You're right.
Yeah, right. Like, okay, so what happened? Why did it happen? And how is it that, like, miraculously, this has never happened again?
Okay. Well, you can start with the design.
Great.
The design is a very simple, cheap design to produce nuclear fuel and electricity. So the Soviets built, I think, 10 of these, maybe 11. And they're located all over the place.
Great.
So a set of them, 4 of them, I think, were at Chernobyl. It's called an RBMK reactor. It's about as cheap as you can make one. It was made to make nuclear fuel.
And that's considered a breeder reactor, right?
It's a breeder.
Okay.
It was a breeder reactor. It wasn't characterized as a breeder reactor, but in fact it was.
Okay.
Which a lot of people will tell you that it's not. But having listened to the detailed design and why from one of the Soviet designers,
It's a breeder reactor. Can never always trust the Soviets.
So on April 26th, 1985, it was being operated in a mode down below 30%, where in their manual that was written by the designers in the Soviet Union, do not operate below 30%. And simply put, you don't need books written about it to tell you this. They wanted to find out what would happen below 30%. They found out.
And when they found, okay, so when you say they wanted to find out, so they get first off, who designed? Okay, so locally, so who designed the original reactor? Were these Soviet scientists?
It was Soviet engineers, but they were designing it to make some nuclear fuel, and they needed to dissipate the heat. So to dissipate the heat, they put a turbine generator associated with it to produce electricity. Now that gives them the ability to dissipate the heat. And in doing so, it was all logical, except they wanted to do it fast under direction of the communists, and they did. So it was a very poor design, simple design, poor design, and it had no containment around it like we do with U.S. reactors and most foreign reactors.
Like 3 Mile Island had robust containment so that they don't have any problem.
And it was also a pressurized water reactor. So not only did it have a containment around it, but it was also a pressurized water reactor with a very robust reactor vessel that would withstand the temperatures and pressures that would be normally seen even in an accident scenario, which it had an accident scenario, and everything was confined inside the reactor vessel, and it was the core simply melted down, and a bunch of it fell down to the bottom, and it became a very large and economical disaster from that standpoint, and we had to figure out how to clean it up and get everything out of there.
And when you say the pressurized water reactor, what this means is both light water reactors are 2 categories: boiling water reactor and pressurized water reactor. The pressurized water reactor has liquid and an original loop, and then there's a secondary loop that grabs the heat from that initial loop. But there's no interaction with the turbine with the things that are also touching the reactor. In the Russian design at Chernobyl, this was a boiling water reactor that has one big loop where you have liquid or heat transfer essentially going through the reactor, taking that heat off, and then running through the turbine and the, again, running through the whole circle. So now you have all these moving parts. You have, valves that are going to be worn out, that are coming in contact with material that was touching the core, all of these things. And that is a different style and, potentially riskier design just inherently.
I can agree with that pretty much for the sake of this conversation, yes.
Okay.
So
I'm sorry. I always try to just summarize things.
I understand.
I know there are a lot of nuances.
So they're operating within this range. Now, previously at another RBMK reactor, they had started to do a similar test. It was in the Soviet Union, and it had people that were, I think some people that were involved were some of the actual RBMK designers. And as soon as they saw this was in 1983, I think, so a couple of years before Chernobyl. So since the Soviet designers were right there, they saw it start to go into a condition that would potentially be another Chernobyl, but they stopped it right away. Fast forward to a couple of years later, Chernobyl on April 26th of 85, they created a similar test. And instead of going to the Soviet designers and asking them for permission or their involvement in the test, they got permission locally.
Okay, so this is like you have national level scientists that designed this thing, and they engage in a test in 83. They start to see warning signs. They're like, hey, stop the test, kill it. No.
That's right.
And then a couple years later, it's like the Russian equivalent of you and me. We're like, hey, man, what do you think happens? It's like, dude, I don't know. Let's find. Hey, let's ask Jim. Hey, Jim, can we? And they're like, yeah, Matt. Yeah, Richard, like, all right, you guys can try it. It's like, should we call the designer? It's like, no, dude, they're going to stop us. Let's see what happens. You're like, okay.
And I'll bet
okay, comrade, turn it to 20. And they turn it down.
I will bet you that's some of the dialogue that happened.
Adjusted for translation.
Much higher probability than not.
Yeah, so you have two localized guys that are just in charge of this plant, and they ask some people, not the Soviet designers, like, hey man, can we run this test? They say sure. Are they required to have the people that designed it in the room? They are not. They start engaging in this test, where again the instruction manual said do not operate this, what is it, 20 or 30%?
Below 30%.
So do not operate this below 30%. And that 30% has to do with a myriad of things, including water circulation that's taking heat away from the core. That has to do with energy, electricity, whatever that 30% was. There are all kinds of things that needed to keep happening in a continuous manner that prevent the core from going into a danger zone. And they're like, hey, take it to 15. And they just drop it down and then see, now what happens?
Now, my understanding from the Soviet reports of 83.
Okay.
So they're very good at reporting it in the best possible light.
Listen, everyone knows if you're on an online dating app, you bring the best pictures forward. You don't bring the picture where you're like brushing your teeth in your pajamas and your hair's my hair, you don't have it. My hair's a mess. You don't do that. You put the bed, you're like your sister's wedding and you're in your tux and it's like the best you've looked ever. So, yeah, look, I'm sympathetic.
Absolutely. So we got to see raw documents. Well, we got to see as prepared by the Soviets, raw documents.
Gotcha.
I mean, the whole purpose of me being at the International Atomic Energy Agency with the other five members of the nations there was because in 1987, the Soviets went to Hans Blix, who was a director general of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and said, our people don't trust us, we need help. So the first time I heard that, I couldn't help but crack up laughing.
Kind of dark, but true.
I know. But little did I know somebody was going to ask me to be on this Six-Nation team at the time. I decided it was ludicrous. Of course, nobody trusts them. So that being said, Hans Blix was smart enough to call our Secretary of Energy. He picked up the phone, I guess, is the way the story is told. He picked up the phone and called our Secretary of Energy, who at the time was retired Admiral James D. Watkins, U.S. Navy. Well, I've known Jim since he was Lieutenant Commander in the Navy. So I knew him all the way up. They picked the right person to be our Secretary of Energy. In my opinion, the only Secretary of Energy we've ever had, including the current one. Because Jim truly understood all energy, and especially nuclear energy. So he called him up, told him the story about the Russians coming to visit, said, we need help. So together they created an idea that became reality. Let's create inside the International Atomic Energy Agency a special study group from several countries. And let's include the Soviet Union. So the study group was, as a country, was identified as the Soviet Union, Switzerland, UK, Spain, Canada, and the United States. And I was asked to be the U.S. representative to it. We had unfettered access to all of the historical data that the International Atomic Energy Agency had collected since its inception in 1954. And it was pretty much created because President Dwight D. Eisenhower saw a reason to have an international agency for nuclear. So once again, on top of his speech in December of 1953 for Atoms for Peace, Prosperity, etc., he was influential, probably was the key person that caused the International Atomic Energy Agency to be formed. So the data that they collected and the work that they did from 1954 to 1989, when we had our first meeting, in our first meeting, Hans Blix, the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, came in and thanked us for being there. He was basically thanking all the countries for participating and sending someone there. And he expressed his interest and caring for about the truth to be known about nuclear power. And our work was entitled Nuclear Fuel Cycle Facilities, the Environment, and Public Opinion. Nuclear fuel cycle facilities was very revealing. And we all had our own access besides the International Atomic Energy Agency. We all had our own experience and access to add to it. So that part of our work was probably more than 50% of our work. Public opinion, we hired some of the best people in the world to come and spend time with us and teach us about public opinion. In fact, we had the head of CNN International out of London come and spend 3 days with us. He was an American. It was also very interesting because, as you may know or not know, CNN at the time was owned by a fellow out of the north or southeast United States who had just married Jane Fonda.
Really?
Yes.
I had no idea.
So now this guy's in charge of the international CNN.
Sure.
So we had him for a couple of days. And there happened to be one of the 2 annual meetings at the International Atomic Energy Agency where everybody shows up. So we told people, and quite a few people signed up. I don't remember how many offices, but we probably had well over 100 people in the room. So people are asking him questions. He's giving them an answer. And behind me, it was a Scandinavian voice. It was a male voice. Ask a question. Well, now that Ted Turner has married Jane Fonda, has any of your programming changed? Now, this is a guy that's the best in the world, right? He halted, he stopped, he waited, thought a little bit too long. So I knew that was a question he was not prepared to answer. But he recovered really well. He said, well, We do have a new environmental bureau,
Ah,
but his hesitation, I think most of the people in the room didn't recognize it, but us that had just spent time talking to him and we were zeroing in on public opinion, I know that everybody else on that Six Nation group, as we went to with ourselves after the meeting, we all recognized that he hesitated just a little too long.
Jane Fonda was one of, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm sure I'll screw this up, but Jane Fonda was one of the ones who was classically not just negative. Many people were critical of Vietnam, but she was critical of like the Vietnam vets and the people that had been drafted
Everything.
and like came down with a hammer on them. Where it's like, wait a minute, I was facing jail time if I didn't go. Like, I'm not happy that I went there either, right? Like, people were, and there are plenty of people that were objecting to Vietnam, but she was one of like the prime celebrities that was like accusatory and real dark towards those people.
Well, you may or may not know, she went to North Korea, North Vietnam, and was with the communists for a few days, including had her picture taken on one of their anti-aircraft guns to shoot our planes down. But it was reported when she was 19 years old. 19 years old, it was reported that in some interview somewhere that she is going to use her money to destroy the United States.
This is Jane Fonda.
Jane Fonda, still alive today.
Kind of a more contemporary example would be Dennis Rodman going to like North Korea, right? I
Right.
mean, this is, except he didn't come out and articulate, glowing reviews of North Korea, but he also takes Kim Jong-un to like basketball games.
Yeah. But you see, communist dictators, there's no limit to the money they have.
Because they can just print whatever money they want.
Because of their position, whether it's in China or Russia or North Korea or Cuba or Venezuela or whatever, they have all the money that they have everything at their disposal. They can do whatever they want. Communist dictators are communist dictators. They haven't changed. They're not going to change. Going back to Chernobyl or to Jane Fonda for a moment, it was the reason I resonated with her comment was I had actually met her father once about the time that she was 19 years old and said that. Now, mind you, I wasn't in the military yet. I just graduated from high school. But once I got in the military, there was common knowledge and people just talking about Jane Fonda in North Korea and supporting North Korea and meeting with our prisoners of war that were there and them trying to give her something to bring back home. And she exposed the fact that they did it. So the question in some people's mind is, how many of our prisoners of war gotten beaten because of it? How many of them were killed because of it? And we'll never know. Even the prisoners of war themselves will never know, because they were individually isolated and individually dealt with. So Jane Fonda, as a human being, in my opinion, should have been locked up for treason. She should have been given a life imprisonment for treason. Then a lot of us started wondering, why wasn't she? Why is she so special that our federal government didn't take a citizen who went to North Korea and appeared in positions against the United States? Well, guess what? She's not the only one. There have been others, and we haven't done anything to them. Nobody's held them accountable. So going back to Chernobyl,
No.
we asked for and we received briefings, including from the Soviet office that was at the International Atomic Energy Agency. And the guy that headed up the Soviet office at the International Atomic Energy Agency, and I actually got to be good friends. He was a communist but being a communist is your best choice. He had been a professor. He had been an operator at one of their reactors in the Soviet Union. He was as conversant about nuclear as anybody I've ever met in the United States. So he had a guy in his office who had actually worked in the bureau, the design bureau, that designed the RBMK reactor. So he felt comfortable enough with us as a group that he had that guy come and brief us on the RBMK reactor under the condition that we would not talk about the actual design and considerations and operations very deeply about the RBMK reactor. But he knew because he was part of the team that designed it. And he was very clear about the fact that the operating manual said it not as clearly as this, but it was as clear as this, plus it had a bunch of other information. And do not operate below 30% power. Now, in the 1983 incident at another RBMK reactor, they had people from the design bureau there that saw this trend, and this was not the only test that had been done of RBMK reactors over the years. But they saw this trend developing, and they shut it down. Not the case in Chernobyl. The case in Chernobyl, the design bureau was not notified. It was, quote, a local person in the Ukraine, Soviet Union, that was in charge. And on April 26th, while conducting that test, and this was not just a short test, they had set this up to basically do what we would call a station blackout. In other words, no more electricity. And they wanted to see, by using a combination of things, they wanted to see if they shut down a couple of the pumps, so the amount of water going through the reactor was less, and they would trip the turbine driving the generator, and their theory was there is some amount of electricity that's produced by that turbine generator as it's coasting down. First of all, you're talking about a massive piece of equipment, a lot of metal, and when it's rotating, has a lot of inertia. So the theory was they would have enough electricity coming from the turbine
As it winds down.
Coupled with the limited amount of pumping power that they had, that it would be safe.
And they could turn the pumps back on if they wanted to.
They could have. Well, it turns out it's not safe. Because in the generator, we have something called a exciter, which works with the turbine and causes it to produce electricity. Well, what evidently they had done somewhere else, they had done something similar to this and found out that the excitation power that was available was inadequate. It was for a much shorter period of time than the people at Chernobyl thought it would be.
So essentially the exciter, which is one of the linchpins in making the electricity, that produced less electricity and for a shorter amount of time than they had hypothesized locally.
Right. As a matter of fact, the coast down time is measured in seconds.
Sure.
So that is part of where they derived this idea or this concept, which they published, do not operate below 30% power. Because somewhere they had already calculated this and found out that the turbine coasting down would not supply them with,
The requisite
say,
power
60 seconds of
Sure.
power
Okay.
of electricity. It would only supply them with, say, 40 seconds of electricity. And the result was an explosion. There was two explosions, one right after the other.
And again, jumping from this, because they didn't have electricity when they needed it, they were not able to turn the pumps back on. The pumps, of course, which would continue circulating water around the core, which would, one, pull heat from the core, right? And two, generate more electricity than it was taking to run the pumps, because then all of that heat then goes over and gets converted into electricity in the generator, in the turbine generator, the exciter, and then that then reinforces the pumps down below that are pushing the water. So as you no longer have requisite electricity to run the pumps. You also can't pull heat away from the core, which was continued reacting whether or not the pumps were running or not.
You're a quick study. Let me tell you how this relates to Fukushima Daiichi. So they have.
Well, they had emergency generators. They were just in the front. And they weren't hardened.
That was a case of Fukushima
Yeah,
Daiichi.
right.
In the case of Chernobyl, they had, I think it was 3 diesel generators.
Okay.
And so you can either start them, or upon loss of power, they can start themselves automatically.
Sure.
Well, let's talk about the shutdown in seconds. That the power available from the turbine was not enough seconds to then keep adding pumping power to pump the water. It gets worse because the diesel generators.
Diesel generators need the starter engine to turn over the engine.
They had that at that point.
Okay. I can't wait. This is great.
But what they didn't have is they had tested them, and they knew that it took something like 45 to 50 seconds for the diesel generator to come up to speed and produce electricity.
Okay.
But they didn't have an opportunity to come up to speed because something at like 43 seconds is when the accident happened.
Oh, so this whole thing melted down within like under a minute?
Well, it was a little bit longer than that, but what it was a cascading effect that they were doing this test, and it got away from them. So the diesel generators could not turn on electricity in time. The turning over of the turbine was thought to be being able to provide electricity longer than it was. So that was shortened. So then they had the first explosion. And it was just simply overheated.
Because, again, as you have all this liquid then around the core, the liquid heats up to the point where you're no longer pulling heat or requisite heat away from the core, and then the core just heats up exponentially, essentially.
And it heated up. And the first explosion, there's a lot of details about this first explosion that was calculated after the fact. But the first explosion was primarily due to heat, which had a release of, since the core came apart, then it released a lot of radioactivity. I forget how long it was to the second explosion, but the second explosion was a combination of water got so hot that it exploded. So that was the second explosion. And
so the first is a core coming apart, and the second is like the pressure cooker blowing up.
Yeah, it blew up everything.
Yeah.
So the first one did enough damage so that radiation started getting out. And the second one, explosion, got a lot of radiation released.
Now, again, because this is a boiling water reactor, all of the water in there is interacting with the core. So it's all coming into contact with the radioactive material. That's really, really bad, especially like it's one thing if you have, an explosion and that explosion is contained within a certain area, but then you have an explosion and releasing of core materials, and then a secondary explosion where all of those core materials have been interacting with how many millions of gallons of water, and then that water becomes a vehicle to dissipate all of that radioactivity.
It was suddenly became steam. So
Gosh.
It took the graphite and it caused the graphite to start burning, and it exploded all through the area. During the initial 2 explosions, one person has never been accounted for. 2 people died. The fireman that showed up to put out the fire of the graphite that now is spread all over the place on fire, it is interesting to listen to read about all their statements and what they encountered and what they thought they encountered. And even one of them said to one of the others about, well, does anybody have any idea how much radiation this is putting out? Because we're probably going to die. So he did die. He was one of the people who eventually died from acute radiation poisoning. So the Soviets did not disclose that this accident had happened, or this, not an accident. This is not an accident. This is something that was driven by poor design and by operators who were operating purposely in an area that they were not supposed to operate in. So the firemen were there to put out the fire. They did as much as they could to put out the fire. It took them until, so the explosion was on the 26th of April. Things continued to burn until May the 10th, as I recall. That'll give you an idea of the magnitude of stuff that could burn, a lot of it being graphite. Soviet Union did not tell anybody about this accident.
For 2 weeks, it's just an inferno.
Well, the only reason that they had to confess that this accident had occurred, and they tried to downplay it, I think it was in Sweden. That the first detectors at another nuclear power plant detected that there was high radiation. And I forget how many days it took for the Soviets to actually announce more of the details of what had happened.
Sure.
But it wasn't until the 28th, 2 days later, that there was so much questions being raised and reported to the International Atomic Energy Agency, being reported to the media by this one plant out of. There were 2 plants in 2 countries. I think the first one was. I don't remember which were the 2 that reported.
Yeah, but they started.
But externally, they started reporting it. And so there was a procedure in place for all commercial nuclear power plants around the world to report an accident, an incident, or whatever. Our work at the International Atomic Energy Agency, don't get me wrong, we didn't start till 1989. So a lot of work had been done by 1989 to create a better reporting system and a more honest reporting system that the Soviets had no choice but to be involved in. China had no choice but to be involved in. So as we studied all of this, we realized that we needed to go to Chernobyl ourselves with these reports in our hands, and we needed to talk to people. We also realized that it was the Soviet Union that went to Hans Blix in 1987 saying our people didn't trust us. So the Soviets went and asked for help. And they were very happy to get the help that was provided with this 6-nation group being formed. And one of the things they told to Hans Blix, if you will help us, we will be open and we will be disclosing things that we've never before wanted anybody to know about our nuclear power program.
Sure.
It turned out to be another lie. Because we asked to go see another one of the RBMK reactors that was operating, not on the Chernobyl site, but somewhere else. We were there for 4 years. The request was constant for 4 years, and they wouldn't approve it. And the Soviet guy that was with us for the first year, their Soviet representative, he had a KGB babysitter. And after the wall fell, a few months after the wall fell, maybe a couple of months after the wall fell, he no longer had a KGB babysitter, but another guy was sent in his place. And then there was a third one that replaced him later on. And between all of them, they could not give permission or grant permission or anything that resembled us looking at another RBMK reactor. Fast forward to 1990. Right after the Chernobyl event, the International Atomic Energy Agency convened a research group to research the Chernobyl event. In 1990, and this doesn't show up anywhere, in 1990, the first report came out. It was a classified report, The person who was in charge of it had, by all accounts, done a really good job. The night before they were going to have the first confidential peer review, I get a call. The International Atomic Energy Agency gets a call from the U.S. Secretary of Energy's office. Mr. McPherson is going to be on the peer review committee. So I walked in the room, and the guy that was in charge of it didn't like me from the day he met me because I asked too many questions. So I had nothing to do with the research report that was done, the first 5-year research report that was done. I walk in the room, and he said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I've been assigned to the peer review committee." He said, "Not by me, you haven't." I said, "Well, the International Atomic Energy Agency, Hans Blick's office, and I got a personal phone call from the Secretary of Energy's office, put me on the peer review." He said, "I'll see about that." Well, guess what he found out? McPherson's on the peer review committee. So they start in. They give us an overview of what the committee had been doing for 5 years. And it was focused on Chernobyl. So I listened to what they had to say for probably an hour. And then I had one question. I said, "Everything you're talking about is from Chernobyl. What other RBMK reactor did you study simultaneously so that you would have a baseline when you're making reports about Chernobyl?" Well, we weren't funded to do that. I said, "Then how can you make claims, these claims you're making about Chernobyl, if you don't have another one with a baseline to study it and the surrounding area?"
Right, because you can't say it's like 115% overpressure if you don't know what the 100% pressure is.
Dead silence. So here, the guy already hated me, so I didn't care, because I want the truth.
Yeah.
And they're supposed to be telling us the truth. Well, they weren't. And they weren't admitting that they didn't do it. Well, because of me, they had to admit in their next report that they did not have another one to study the baseline. Now, in the next one, they had the opportunity to say what we had found. The Soviet Union would not allow us to go visit another RBMK reactor. They left that out of the second report also. So Chernobyl is very simple. You had a bad design. You had operators that took upon themselves to do a test, knowing about the test that was done in 1983, that they locally authorized it. It was not authorized out of Russia, Soviet Union. And they found out what would happen and why that note was in there, don't operate below 30%, because it overheats. I mean, that's not what the note said, but it was operating in a dangerous area you can't operate in. Well, everybody found out what happened. It overheats and explodes, puts radiation all over the place.
Wow. It sounds like, as frustrating and horrific as the humanitarian cost of that is, and frustrating from a design standpoint, those two things, poor design and poor operators, seem like two things that we should be able to lick in this time frame of the world. It's like, we're in 2025, can we come up with a better design than the Soviets in the 70s and 80s? And can we get operators that don't do what the manual says explicitly don't do?
So keep in mind that was 1985.
Right.
The Soviets basically have access to almost everything we do and talk about. You go back to TMI, and by 1981, 2, 3, 4, 5, there was a ton of information out about what happens when a reactor overheats. Ton of information.
Even from like a scientific standpoint, not even from a commercial standpoint.
From everything associated with it. So they'd already found out themselves in 1983, whoa, stop this test. So the other people, we tried to find out. So backing off from asking to visit them, we backed off and wanted to know, how do all these different plants, RBMK reactors, how do they communicate what they're learning, lessons learned day to day? at one point we were given something that at first glance makes sense. But we also had people that we knew from the Soviet Union that said that's not what we do. So it's part of the misinformation that you get out of communists. It's I don't know how far back we can go in time, but communists have been communists. And they can come so close to giving you information that you believe it, but it's misinformation overall.
Gotcha. Richard, this concludes our triple set for Chernobyl, Fukushima, and then 3 Mile Island. Thank you for this rundown. And now that we're past the classic accidents, we can get on to more interesting goodies. But thanks for breaking all these down for me.
It's my pleasure, and I'm just trying to give back. I'm at a time in my life that I'm trying to give back, so at least America has a chance.
Yeah. Well, thank you for what you're doing. Appreciate it. We'll do it again.
Okay, looking forward to it.